Well, I haven't done too much damage yet. You all keep coming back. Well, at least some of you do. So, if you're visiting with us, we're in our fourth week of the study of the book of Thessalonians, the books of Thessalonians, to the Thessalonians. We're in First Thessalonians, and this week we'll be talking about chapter 2, beginning in verse 17, where we left off last Sunday, and we'll try to get through chapter 3, verse 13. I am just not quick. Here we go. So let's just do a very brief review from last week. I had some questions here that would help us start today off. So from last week's study, what did Paul said that their work in Thessalonica was not in vain. So what was the evidence or the proof that it was not in vain? Yes, sir. That's right. And we'll get into that today. They're hearing about the success of the work in Thessalonica and specifically what happened in Thessalonica. The establishment of what? The church in Thessalonica. Okay? So their work was not in vain. They being Paul, Silas, Timothy. Okay? How did their teaching differ from other teaching that the Thessalonians, the people in Thessalonica, would have been exposed to over the years? And think about the influences in Macedonia. What were the primary influences there if we want to talk about religion in the broadest sense, a very broad sense? Okay. Yes. They were turning from idols to God. They worshipped idols. We talked about Mount Olympus, which was to the Greeks the dwelling place or the home of the principal gods. I think 12 of the gods supposedly lived there. So it was only about 60 miles, as we would say, as the crow flies from Thessalonica. They could maybe see on a clear day Mount Olympus. So they had been exposed their whole lives to idol worship, to these gods and goddesses that supposedly existed. How else did their teaching differ maybe from others? What was their motive, for example? Was it money? Were they teaching for monetary gain? Gwen's shaking her head no. No, it wasn't for money. They had just come from what city? And they were bearing the stripes of what had happened in that city. Philippi. So you've got to think, these guys are really sincere because they were willing to take a beating for this, and in fact they were imprisoned. They're willing to take a beating for what they're preaching. Okay? So those are some ways that their teaching differed. Anybody else? Think of something? Okay. We talked a little bit about this last week. There's a reference in one of the verses from last week talking about God test our hearts. And what did we kind of conclude about what that means? How God tests our hearts. How does He test our hearts? Yeah. Greg said He examines our hearts. Okay. And I think that's, Chuck's not here this morning, but that was one of the words that Chuck came up with last week, examining our hearts. And then lastly, how do we walk worthy of God? That's kind of a big chunk there. Walking worthy of God. Gwen. Say it again. Okay. Display love to our fellow man. Okay. That's certainly one way we walk worthy of God. The concept being that we are ambassadors. We represent God on earth. What other ways may we display walking worthy of God? Here's one. Anybody sent their taxes in yet? I'm mailing mine today because we owe. If we were going to get back, it would have been earlier. Sometimes we talk about cheating on taxes. Integrity. We show integrity is one way that we walk worthy of God. Okay? There are a lot of ways. Yes, sir. Yeah, good point. That integrity is sometimes defined as doing the right thing when nobody else is watching. Being able to put our head down at night on our pillow and not and go to sleep without regret or without concern that we did the wrong thing, purposely did the wrong thing. So anyway, there are a lot of ways that we can show that we're walking worthy of God in our day-to-day walk, our language, our integrity, our love, just a number of ways that we can demonstrate that. Okay, well, let's get into today's lesson. I know this is a little small. It's kind of hard when you're doing this at home on a laptop to know how it's going to portray, but we'll do our best here. Okay, so really we can divide today's lesson kind of into three sections, more or less. And this is the first section, which I've got titled here on my notes, "The Reason for Sending Timothy." So remember that they've been driven out of Thessalonica, that Paul then goes to Athens, and then he winds up in Corinth, and Corinth is where the city from which he is writing this letter. But we, brethren, have been taken away from you for a short time in presence, not in heart, endeavored more eagerly to see your face with great desire. Therefore, we wanted to come to you, even I, Paul, time and again, but Satan hindered us. For what is our hope, our joy, our crown of rejoicing? Is it not even you in the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ at his coming? For you are our glory and joy. Therefore, when we could no longer endure it, we thought it good to be left in Athens alone and send Timothy, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and encourage you concerning your faith. No one should be taken by these afflictions, for you ourselves know that we are appointed to this. For in fact, we told you before, when we were with you, that we would suffer tribulation, just as it happened, and you know. For this reason, when I could no longer endure it, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter has tempted you, and our labor might be in vain. So Timothy is going back to Thessalonica to check on things. taken from you um, for a short time. I did some reading on this. Does anybody have an idea? And maybe you have a different idea. But does anybody have an idea about how long scholars think that he had been gone at this point from the Thessalonians? I did some reading on it. The consensus was maybe 6 months, which is a fair amount of time. Remembering that these are new Christians. They are in a hostile environment, if you will. So it's been, say, 6 months. He twice, he says, in this passage alone, he talks about could endure it no longer. Had to know, how are things going? The American Standard Version, in that first verse, actually uses the word being bereaved. That's a pretty strong word, isn't it? Being bereaved. We think of being bereaved at the loss of someone. That he felt that strongly about that. Yes, ma'am. Orphaned. Okay. And you have the International Version, NIV. Okay. Any other renderings in that verse? Corey, you weren't here a couple of weeks ago. You were, I think, at Valley Station. And we talked about your work in India. How did it feel? I didn't ask you this before, so I don't mean to set you up, but so you would go into a village and you would preach for a day or two. You would baptize some people, and then you had to leave. How did you feel when you left? Now, there are some brethren there that are going to go back, but it must have been a little bit worrisome to leave them, such new Christians. Right, right. It's for them, from a scriptural standpoint, it's a hostile environment. Yeah. So we certainly thought about Corey's and others and Prim's work in India and new Christians. It's the way Paul felt here. Great concern. So he talks about, that they've had to leave here. They had to leave here kind of in a hurry, too. The brethren got them out of town. So it wasn't like, it doesn't seem that they had a lot of opportunity to go back and say, now we're getting ready to leave and what have you, and give a proper farewell, so to speak. In verse 18, he says, therefore we wanted to come to you, even I, Paul, time and time again, but Satan hindered us. Well, how did Satan hinder them? Well, let's go back to remember that the establishment of the church in Thessalonica is found in Acts 17. And we've talked about this some already, but how did Satan hinder their work? What Yeah, exactly. Satan kept them from going to where they wanted to go or staying where they wanted to stay, right? And so back in chapter 17, just a reminder of who the agent, so to speak, the agents of Satan were that hindered the work. And once again, it's the Jews, the unbelieving Jews, the ones that are not converted, the ones that want to stay with the old law. Says, but you know, when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that Paul, and this is when he went to Berea, right? They're already running, so to speak, out of Thessalonica. Now he goes to Berea. They chase him to Berea. Then they have to end up going to Athens. And we know he wasn't terribly successful in Athens from what we can read in chapter 17. We don't know, but it appears that wasn't very successful. I believe they said we'll hear more about, they wanted to hear about it, but because they were interested in a lot of talk and a lot of philosophy. So this is how Satan hindered. Okay, let's bring it down to a practical level. How does Satan hinder us today? What things does Satan do to us that hinders us, maybe teaching or setting the right example, or whatever it may be in our walk with God? Yes, Gwen. Mm-hmm. Our work life. Gwen says jobs. They can hinder us. Um, what else? And that's a good one. What else? What else can hinder us? Hmm. Okay. Yeah. Why try? Yeah. Okay. Putting doubt in our minds that the work will be effective, that what we do will be effective. What else? Do we ever get lazy? No? Gwen says no. That's great. Yes, ma'am. Terry? Yeah. That's an excellent point. Yes, Greg. Okay. God could never forgive me, right? I'm not good enough. Yes, ma'am. And that's kind of what you said is what the fear is what is happening here. These are, as we call them, babes in Christ. They don't have the influences around them, and so he's concerned. Yeah, those are all good points, Pam. Discouraged. Okay, so we have to be careful among ourselves that we don't do things that can be discouraging to others. Um, and I think about the meat offered to idols. For Paul it was no big deal, but he had to think about others around him that might cause them to stumble. So there are a lot of ways that Satan can hinder us. Anybody would have just as soon stayed in bed this morning. There are a couple of us honest people here, right? It would have been easy to just roll over, right? Go back to sleep. But I like Terry's point about, I liked all the points, but Terry makes an excellent point about, he knows our weaknesses on an individual level, and he's going to attack those weaknesses. So we have to work on strengthening those areas so that he has less targets to work on. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, absolutely. And sin, and not saying that's sinful, but just saying sin in general is typically is kind of fun, isn't it? I mean, if it wasn't fun, why would we want to sin? So those are all really good points. Appreciate the comment. And I really, I really don't envy parents today of young children because I think it's just, I don't know, maybe it's the way our parents thought about us, but it just seems that it's tougher and tougher all the time to raise kids these days. All right, anything else? Okay, so let's go back to verse 19. For what is our hope, our joy, our crown of rejoicing? Um, in what sense is this their crown of rejoicing? Not the Thessalonians, but Paul, Silas, Timothy. When you think of that phrase, does it bring anything to mind? Have you ever heard the expression, such and such did something, and that was the crowning event of their year? Right? That was the penultimate. That was the apex. Um, somebody over here? Harry. Mm-hmm. That's the goal, isn't it? Yeah. Certainly, this book um, is, to me, has a little bit different tenor than some of the other writings of Paul. This is more like the Apostle John, the Apostle of Love, writing, because this is all about, I'm concerned about you, I love you, I miss you. I want to be with you. Um, very much expressing his closeness, even though he wasn't there very long, feeling very close to these folks. Right. Yeah. And he talked about, I think, earlier, one of our earlier lessons, he talked about um, like a father or like a parent feels about their children. Um, so when we think of crown, I thought of some other passages. He uses the same verbiage in Philippians 4:1, my joy and my crown. You think of the passage in Revelation, be faithful unto death and I'll give you a crown of life. It's not the sense of royalty, but it's more of a sense of achievement, of accomplishment. I saw one thing that said, let's see, get back to my other note. Something very good and difficult at which you've succeeded. And there was a thought that by one of the commentators that this would be a bit like an athlete that wins an event, maybe at the Olympics, and wins a wreath or a crown. But his king is not present at the event, but the next time he sees his king, he lays this crown at his feet as if to say, this is yours. I was able to get it for you, but you're my king and this belongs to you. And so someday, Paul is, at the coming of Christ, he wants to be able to say, this is what we were able to do at Thessalonica. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Established? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. I like the point. I like your point, but I like your point specifically about where you talked about this is not to Paul's glory, right? This is not to his glory. This is to God's glory. But he can still take great satisfaction, can he, in what they've accomplished here to this point in time. Anything else? Yep. Yep. Almost the exact same words. You're my joy and my crown. Okay. He talks about in verse 20, for you are our glory and joy. Therefore, when we could no longer endure it, there's that phrase again, just can't stand it. We'd say, I just can't stand it. I've got to do something about this. Sent Timothy to minister. I believe that the original word here is the same word that is used, that we use for deacons. Ministering meaning serving, a servant. Sent Timothy to minister to them. Something that we also need to remember here is, so at least when you left a village or a town, you were able to leave them this. He wasn't able to leave them this. Right? So they needed reinforcement. They needed all the support that they could get from the sound brethren. That no one should be shaken. Let's talk about that word shaken. I'm not a Greek scholar at all, but the Greek word meant agitated, disturbed, or troubled. And so who's going to trouble them? Satan. The same old nemesis, right? But the agents through which Satan's going to work are going to be what? The teachings of about the gods and goddesses of the Greek mythology. It's going to be the Jews that keep, they just keep on their trail. They're just not going to let go. And I was thinking about this. In Paul's life, did he ever get to a point where he was not being persecuted or said, wow, finally got through that, those Jews, and they'll leave me alone now. They're convinced. He never did he? And in a sense, we never get to that point either, do we? Satan's always after us, after our weaknesses. Our friends, our children, they have influences on them. So are we physically persecuted? Well, not in this country. Not yet. I think that doesn't happen. But we're persecuted in different ways if we're doing what we should be doing. So he again, he says, we told you this was going to happen. And this has happened. This has happened to us, Paul, Silas, Timothy. It's going to happen to you. So be prepared. To be forewarned is to be forearmed, is one way of looking at it. Okay, let's move to the second section, which is really verses 6 through 10. But now that Timothy has come to us from you and brought us good news of your faith and love, and that you always have good remembrance of us, greatly desiring to see us, as we also to see you. Therefore, brethren, in all our affliction and distress, we were comforted concerning you by your faith. For now we live, if you stand fast in the Lord. For what thanks can we render to God for you, for all the joy with which we rejoice for your sake before our God, night and day, praying exceedingly that we may see your face and perfect what is lacking in your faith. And we'll stop there. I think one of the significant words in verse 6 is that little four-letter word, your faith. He didn't say the faith. He said your faith. This is very personal. This is very individual. And he talked about in verse 7, in all our affliction and distress. Well, could be talking about affliction and distress that he had in Philippi. Could be talking about being chased around Greece by the Jews. But remember from what city he is writing this letter. He's in Corinth. He's been to Athens, been to Corinth. Were there any problems in Corinth? Any problems with the church in Corinth? Yeah, a few, right? And perhaps this is talking about when he says, in all our affliction and distress, it's not just what happened in Philippi. It's not just being chased. It's, I got problems where I am now, you know, and I have things that I worry about every day with the brethren. And so we might think about it in those terms. He goes on in verse 8 to say we now live. Well, of course they're alive. So what does this mean, we now live, if you stand fast in the Lord? Spiritually? Okay, thank Tim. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. That despite all the bad stuff that's going on and that I'm dealing with, you enliven me when I think about you. We have a term, I think it's fairly recent, in the last few years, living your best life. Are you living your best life? So in a sense, when he thought about the Thessalonians, it helped him live his best life, perhaps. All right. That was, yes. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. Poor Jason got dragged into this thing, literally, didn't he? Yeah, sure did. And the joy he's talking, I'm sorry, was there a hand up? That's okay, go ahead. We're hanging with you. Oh, I think that's definitely the case. This Timothy comes back and he has this good report. You know, all in all, things are going pretty well there. And that gives Paul a great sense of relief. Um, we might say, I can breathe now. Um, and I'm sure he was rejoicing about the report that they got. Absolutely. Yep. Very encouraging. You know, sometimes, do you ever feel like you take one step forward and two steps back on a project? But you need those one steps forward to keep you going, don't you? For the golfers in the room, we occasionally talk about this. I'm not a golfer, but I've played enough to know that you hit the one good shot, and that sustains you for the 20 bad shots that you're going to make thereafter, right? Good points. And this joy, of course, we understand this joy is not, it's not physical, about physical things. This is not about, wow, I've really profited this week, made a lot of money, or whatever that may be. This is about spiritual joy. Let's quickly go to the last 3 verses, because this is the last little segment. And he really restates his desire to visit them. And this is, in essence, a prayer, where he says, now may our God and Father himself and our Lord Jesus Christ direct our way to you. May the Lord make you increase and abound in love to one another and to all, just as we do to you, so that he may establish your hearts blameless in holiness before our God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ with all his saints. He also has similar in 1 Thessalonians 5:23, in 2 Thessalonians 2:16 and 3:15 through 16. These are almost mini prayers, praying that he can go back and see them, that he'll get to see them, they'll get to see him. And I was looking to see if Paul ever got back to Thessalonica specifically. And maybe somebody has found this, but I couldn't really find that. I could find that he certainly made another missionary journey, and he certainly went through this general area again. But to say specifically he got in Thessalonica, I'm not sure. If you find that, I'd like to know. Would appreciate it. Anything else? Any other comments, thoughts? Well, thank you for your participation this morning. Next week will be our meeting. So the following week, we will be studying the first 12 chapters of the first 12 chapters. Oh boy, we're really going to blaze through it. We'll study the first 12 verses of chapter 4 of 1 Thessalonians. Thank you.